Thank you very much for joining us today. We are very pleased to be able to present to you Ambassador Yoram Ettinger. As all of you are aware, yesterday Secretary of State John Kerry went on a rant for over an hour, essentially blaming the impasse on the Israeli-Palestinian peace process entirely on Israel. And within it, he basically premised the issue of the need for a Palestinian state on the fact that Israel cannot be both a democracy and a Jewish state because of the democratic trends. And there is nobody more qualified than Ambassador Yoram Ettinger to be able to talk about this today. Now, my pleasure to give the floor to Yoram Ettinger, who will discuss the reaction from Jerusalem about Secretary of State Kerry's words yesterday.
Well, thank you very much, and happy Hanukkah. In a nutshell, I would define Secretary Kerry's presentation as a classic display of suspension of disbelief. Suspension of disbelief, namely the well-intentioned subordination of documented facts and common sense to one's zeal and wishful thinking, and in the process sacrificing long-term realism on the altar of oversimplification and short-term convenience. The speech of John Kerry, in my mind, should be assessed against the backdrop of his own track record in the Middle East. And just a reminder, John Kerry, when he served in the Senate, in fact in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, also became eventually the chairman of that committee. He was one of the most frequent flyers from Washington to Damascus, and he used to meet very frequently with Hafiz Assad and then with the son Bashar Assad, on occasions also accompanied by his wife, and dining with the Assads. And his attitude towards Bashar, towards Hafiz, and later on towards Bashar, has been was very positive, and he defined them as potential leaders for peace, as very credible people whose word was very, very secure, and in fact, as late as March 2011, we're talking already about the boiling scene inside Syria. He was quoted as saying that Syria will move and will change as it embraces legitimate relations with the U.S. in the West. And he called for lowering sanctions on Syria. And indeed, Syria has moved, but not in the direction that John Kerry expected. We're talking now about different assessments, but some of them go as high as 400,000 people killed in Syria, and about 10 million refugees out of 18 million Syrians. About 4 million refugees outside of Syria, and 6 million refugees in Syria itself. When it comes to the Palestinian issue, John Kerry was one of those people who embraced Arafat as a supposed messenger of peace, and in fact he wrote a book. He published a book in 1997 called The New War. And in that book, he praised Arafat as a terrorist transformed into a statesman, or an outlaw transformed into a statesman, and he referred to him as a role model for other terrorists who should be regarded as potential statesmen. By the way, for anyone who wants to buy that book, and as evidence to the quality of the book, it's being sold now by Amazon for 1 cent. 1 cent. By the way, exactly the price which one would pay if one would buy the 1993 book by the late Shimon Peres, The New Middle East. When it comes to Kerry's track record upon the emergence or the eruption of the Arab tsunami, not only was he one of those guys referring to the Arab tsunami as Arab Spring, but he also referred to the Arab tsunami as a transition towards democracy, and he also referred to the regime changes, the violent regime changes in Tunisia and Libya, Egypt, Yemen, as youth and Facebook revolutions. I mention all that, and there are many other such evidences of total misreading of the Middle East scene, because we should be aware what sort of credibility should be accorded to John Kerry's assessments, who has been, just like the Department of State, wrong and wronger and wrongest, at least on Middle East issues. I assume that the rest of the global scene is not that different when it comes to John Kerry's expertise. When it comes to the speech itself, the speech from yesterday, I would like to highlight a few elements there, and the first one is that during the speech, in fact, in the beginning of the speech, he mentioned that negotiation between Israel and Palestinian Authority did not fail because of gaps which are too wide, but, to quote him, because the level of trust was too low, and which is, I think, a classic evidence to how simplistic, maybe even ignoramus, is the person, attributing the failure to a problem of trust. And that is, again, it goes back to the suspension of disbelief when you sacrifice the complex reality on the altar of wishful thinking, because Kerry moves the Palestinian reality to the backseat. We are talking about Palestinian leadership, which failed in every single test of its commitment to peaceful coexistence with the Jewish state. The first test was in 1993, the Oslo Accord, which I would define as a reckless, next to suicidal policy by Israel, which provided the Palestinians that which they did not receive from the Ottoman Empire or the British Mandate, or from Jordan or from Egypt or from the Arab League. It was a Jewish government which provided them for the first time with semi-sovereign recognition west of the Jordan River. And then there was the test in 2000 when Prime Minister Ehud Barak submitted unprecedented proposals of sweeping Israeli concessions all the way to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And then the 2005, another test, the uprooting of all Jewish settlements from Gaza, few settlements in Samaria, and the response by the Palestinians to each one of those tests of their own commitment to peaceful coexistence was to be expected. Namely, the response was escalation of hate education, of terrorism, and more non-compliance with agreements, and that was supposed to be expected because, again, it's not a question of the level of trust is too low, as the Secretary of State assumes. It's the foundation of the problem has to do with hate education, K through 12, and the incitement among the entire Arab population in Judea, Samaria, and Gaza. And that hate education has become the most effective production line of terrorists, but also this is the most authentic reflection of the nature of the Palestinian strategic goal and real attitude towards Israel. And as we know from our private life, that which we tell our children and grandchildren reflects us and our intentions much more credibly than that which we say to our friends, to our neighbors. Another point of which represents the many pitfalls of Secretary of State Kerry's speech has to do with the decision to ignore or to minimize the reference, the importance of the very long-term track record of Palestinian leadership. And that started in the 1920s and 1930s and 1940s, the wave of anti-Jewish Palestinian terrorism, all the way through their collaboration with Nazi Germany, later on with the USSR and the rogue East European communist regimes, Ayatollah Khomeini, Saddam Hussein, North Korea, Cuba, Venezuela, and obviously being a role model, which they were of international terrorism at large, and particularly Islamic terrorism, African, Asian, European, Latin American terror organizations. And last and not least, when it comes to the track record of the Palestinian leadership, which should play the central role of assessments of the Palestinians by anyone in the U.S. or in Israel, this is their role in intra-Arab politics. There is a reason why Mahmoud Abbas and other Palestinian leaders are welcome in Western capitals, Washington included, by red carpet, while they are welcomed in a shabby rag form by Arab capitals, by Arab leaders. And the reason has to do with the systematic, traditional, violent backstabbing of Arab hosts by the Palestinians, namely in the old days Arafat and currently by Mahmoud Abbas. And we saw that in Egypt during the 50s, where they were engaged in subversive activities inside Egypt. Arafat and Mahmoud Abbas and their colleagues, they were part of the Palestinian cell of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. Syria opened its doors after they had to flee Egypt, but by 1966 they started to terrorize Syria. They had to flee Syria. Jordan opened its arms, and in fact they used the Jordanian platform as a place to launch terror activities against Israel between 1968 and 1970. By 1970, they decided to try and topple the regime of their host, the Hashemite, which produced what we call Black September, where the Jordanians drove the PLO out of Jordan. From there, they continued to plunder and try to take over control of Lebanon, and the latest chapter of Palestinian treachery took place in Kuwait, where they collaborated with Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait by availing 3 Palestinian battalions stationed in Iraq, which partook in the invasion of Kuwait, and from inside Kuwait, Palestinians provided the invading Iraqi troops necessary intelligent information, and that was the cause for the expulsion of almost 300,000 Palestinians from Kuwait, a country which continuously was a safe haven for Palestinians following their expulsion from Egypt and Syria and Jordan and Lebanon, and here once again backstabbing, and that certainly attests to their candidacy for partners for peace. So I would say it contradicts the assumption that they are partners for peace. Another pitfall of Kerry's presentation refers to the introduction of his speech, where he basically stated that the two-state solution is the only way to achieve a just and lasting peace between Israel and the Palestinians. And he even said that the nature of the vote in the UN was about the preservation of the two-state solution. However, when one refers or when one relies on the track record of the Palestinian leadership, with the conduct of the Palestinian leadership globally and regionally and domestically, one cannot escape an obvious conclusion that a Palestinian state would constitute another rogue and violent regime in the Middle East, which would undermine very vital American interest and values, which would add fuel to the regional fire. Anyone who knows the history of the Hashemites in Jordan on one hand and the Palestinians east and west of the Jordan River on the other hand, but especially the PLO, which, by the way, until today is the source of the authority of the Palestinian Authority. Anyone who is familiar with such relationship knows that it's a zero-sum game. And a Palestinian sovereign state west of the river would basically doom the Hashemites east of the river. I know personally that during the signing of the peace accords between Jordan and Israel, as I was told by then the Israeli chief of staff and Israeli chief of military intelligence, both of them were approached by the Jordanian counterparts who warned them, or who begged them actually, to make sure that the late Rabin did not go all the way to allowing for Palestinian sovereignty west of the river, which according to the Hashemites would mean death sentence to the Hashemites east of the river. Now, this is not exactly consistent with American interests, because any regime change in Jordan, which is very unstable regime, would mean a blow to stability and therefore to America's interests. It probably would spill over into Saudi Arabia, possibly into other pro-American Gulf states, all of which could mean devastation of American economic and national security interest in the Persian Gulf area, in the Middle East as a whole, and certainly a Palestinian state would destabilize the already unstable reality in Egypt. We're talking about potentially tight ties between the Ayatollahs of Iran and the Palestinian state, if there is such an entity, and that could lead to Ayatollahs control or dominated bloc from Tehran all the way to Ramallah, west of the Jordan River. Certainly a Palestinian state would enhance the Russian position in the Middle East as a whole, certainly in the Eastern Mediterranean. What would stop the Palestinians from according the Russian Navy, maybe even the Chinese or Iranian Navy, docking naval rights in the port of Gaza? Would that be consistent with the interest of the U.S. Sixth Fleet in the Mediterranean? I doubt it very much. And another point which I would like to make briefly before we turn to Q&A or any opinion on your side. John Kerry attempted to soothe Israeli concerns by referring to security arrangements and security guarantees and support by U.S. and agreements with the Arabs and with the Palestinians, namely everything but the Israeli own capabilities to defend themselves. And I'm saying that because there is an illusion that security treaties guarantees constitute credible element to rely on. But if you look even at a treaty which is considered to be the tightest treaty, NATO treaty, a NATO treaty commits the U.S. Upon an attack on a NATO member, it commits the U.S. to consider, and I emphasize the word, to consider steps on behalf of the attacked NATO member. And here it's a quote from the NATO Accord, as it, the U.S., deems necessary. Namely, it's open. An example, by the way, was the 1954 defense treaty concluded by President Eisenhower with Taiwan. It was annulled unilaterally by President Carter, and that step was supported by the U.S. Supreme Court, by the U.S. Congress. The bottom line is, when it comes to international agreements, we're talking fundamentally about non-specificity and non-automaticity and ample escape routes which obviously Israel should not rely on. Secretary of State Kerry also referred to UN Security Council Resolution 242, and while he did not specifically say that the resolution calls for Israeli withdrawal from all the territories, but the way he phrased it created such an impression because he said, to quote it, he said, 242 called for the withdrawal of Israel from territory that was occupied in 67 in return for peace and secured borders. The vast majority of viewers and listeners and readers are not very much informed about the nuances. Did it say the territory or just territory? Now, the fact is that there was a major debate prior to the vote on the resolution, and the Security Council dropped the word "the" because the idea was not to prejudge the outcome of the process, of the negotiation. The idea was not to dictate to Israel what is and what isn't required for Israel's security. And in that context, we should be aware that Israel has already complied with 242 by conceding 90% of the territories acquired through the 1967 war, namely the evacuation of the entire Sinai Peninsula. Moreover, we should be aware that Israel acquired that land in a war of defense, in a preemptive war of defense in 1967, and certainly there was no sovereignty there. No one but for Britain and Pakistan recognized Jordanian sovereignty. Jordan itself, the Hashemites, waived their claim for sovereignty back in 1988, and Israel, until this very day, possesses the best legal title over Judea and Samaria, otherwise known as West Bank, based on Articles 77 and 80 of the UN Charter, which codify the 1922 League of Nations mandate for Palestine, which aimed at establishing a Jewish national home. And last and not least, I would like to refer to what John Kerry repeated few times, and again, while not specifically suggesting that Jews may become a minority if they decide to annex Judea and Samaria, but he kept talking about Israel has to make a choice. You want to be Jewish, you want to be democratic, and he alluded to what we hear too often, that in order to preserve our demography, we need to give up the geography of Judea and Samaria. I don't want to take more than a few seconds, but just stating, based on a study which I have participated in since 2004, and it goes on until this very day. In the combined area of Judea, Samaria, and pre-67 Israel, currently there is a 66% Jewish majority, which trends upward. It trends upward because we have experienced in the last 15 or so years unprecedented westernization of Arab demography, while Jews have experienced very robust demography, fertility-wise, and obviously when it comes to migration, which includes Aliyah, and Aliyah has increased in recent years. One and last comment has to do with the issue of moral equivalence. It seems to me that the very, very intense effort by Secretary John Kerry to create moral equivalence between the Jewish state on the one hand and the Palestinian authority on the other hand, that moral equivalence is the epitome of what immorality is all about. And again, if we go back to the profile of the Palestinians from their collaboration with the Nazis until contemporary hate education and terrorism, I think it's outrageous to even try and create such moral equivalence, which goes back to the classic superficial ignoramus attempt to suggest one's terrorist is somebody else's freedom fighter. Well, this is not the case, because terrorists do attempt systematically and deliberately to kill innocent people, civilians, while freedom fighters do not focus on civilians. Sometimes, by mistake, they do hit civilians. I would like to end here and turn to you, not only for questions, but anybody wants to rebut or add certain points, I would welcome it.
Yoram, thank you very much. This is Sarah. I just would like to augment some of your comments, because in the wake of the 1967 war, in November of 1967, when UN Resolution 242 was being debated and when the language was decided upon, the assistant Russian foreign minister was outraged and said, this leaves Israel with so much leeway, because we didn't say that they have got to give up all of the territories that they occupied, but just to give up territories. And Secretary of State John Kerry had said that UN Resolution 242, going along the 1949 armistice lines, which are really the pre-1967 boundaries, has always been regarded by every president as the ideal outline for a future Palestinian state. But from Johnson on, Johnson, Nixon, certainly Bush, George W. Bush in his April 14, 2004 letter, said that in light of realities on the ground, there's no way that Israel could return to the pre-1967 boundaries. So that was just an outrageously fallacious comment.
We have had many UN resolutions which were supposed to clip the wings of the Jewish state. Certainly Zionism, racism, probably was the most outrageous. And eventually it was erased from the chronicles of the United Nations. We had an outrageous resolution adopted during President Carter's lame duck session. And again, since that resolution, Jewish presence in Judea, Samaria catapulted dramatically. It boils down, in my mind, to the reaction and steps taken by Israel. And the major question facing at this stage leaders of Israel is not only holding on until January 20th, when a new tenant will move in to the White House. The most important challenge is, are Israeli leaders going back to the days of Ben-Gurion and Eshkol and Golda Meir and Begin and Shamir, who withstood major egregious international and U.S. pressure, but made up their mind not to sacrifice long-term interest on the altar of short-term convenience. It certainly is not convenience to be targeted by certain negative international repercussion, which, by the way, I don't see it. But let's assume that there could be some economic and diplomatic repercussion. The major question is the cost of withstanding those repercussions higher or lower than the cost of clipping or downsizing the strategic goals of the Jewish state? And we can go back to the days of Begin and Reagan. There were months, literally months, that President Reagan would not take a call from Begin. It started with bombing of the nuclear reactor in Baghdad, which earned us the term modern-day pirates by people at the cabinet of President Reagan, most noticeably Vice President Bush at that time, all the way through Begin's application of the Israeli law to the Golan Heights. And once again, Reagan came in with new sets of pressure and threats to impose military embargo, to suspend delivery of military systems, and the response by Mr. Begin was that Israel survived 3,000 years without security agreements with the U.S., and we may have to continue 3,000 more years without such agreements. Now, that certainly was not welcomed by Reagan, but at the same time, it definitely enhanced Reagan's respect towards Begin, because countries do not respect leaders that subordinate themselves to pressure and threats. Certainly, the next President-elect Trump, is not going to respect Israel if Israel will display any type of retreat in view of UN or American attempts to pressure. And moving back to January 21st, my own assessment, and this is an assessment which will have to withstand the test of time, but my own assessment is that we are now facing potentially a historical opportunity to upgrade the already extremely robust cooperation between U.S. and Israel. There is a historical opportunity to surge it to unprecedented levels. As a result of, at least my assessment, of President-elect Trump, and certainly knowing Vice President Mike Pence, whom I have known since 2000 when he first ran to the House, we are talking about unprecedented team of support to U.S.-Israel mutually beneficial ties, and a team which realizes the benefits to America from such ties. So I don't suggest complacency in view of the UN vote and Secretary Kerry's speech. And by the way, I'm not sure that we have seen the whole thing. I would be shocked if there will not be another so-called surprise between now and January 20th. So I don't suggest complacency, but at the same time, we should not resort to pessimism, certainly not to fatalism. Well, certainly Israel should have long time ago followed the rules set by the Oslo Accords, which, as I defined before, I view it as a potentially suicidal agreement. But no agreement should persist when violated unilaterally by one of the parties. Oslo Accords have been violated many, many times before. For the Palestinians to declare independence outside of an agreement with Israel as specified by the Oslo Accord, which does not allow for unilateral action by either side, that would mean an abrogation of the Oslo Accords, which then provides Israel with ample opportunities. One of them, I think the one we should have done long time ago, annexation of Area C, which is 60% of Judea and Samaria. Certainly, we should include right away Ma'ale Adumim, the Jewish settlement east of Jerusalem, to the municipal lines of Jerusalem. Probably likewise Gush Etzion block, and extend the city lines of Jerusalem. Certainly, all financial and other support extended generously and I think recklessly by Israel to the Palestinian Authority should be stopped. The Palestinians rely heavily on Israeli financial support, supply of water, supply or facilitation of movement around, using international passages to get out of Judea and Samaria, all of which could be, probably should be activated by Israel. As far as the U.S., irrespective of the Israeli policy, the U.S. has to examine the whole false notion that a Palestinian state bodes well or is consistent with America's interests and America's values. And in fact, as I suggested before, a Palestinian state would undermine severely both American values and America's interests. Certainly, the American taxpayer should not fund Palestinian hate education, as I'm sure most of you, all of you know very well. Every year, the Palestinian Authority receives $400 million foreign aid, complement of the American taxpayer money. We know very well that money is fungible, and those $400 million do finance, among other things, hate education, and this hate is not only anti-Israel and anti-Jewish, it's also partly anti-American. And Congress, which has the power of the purse, as far as I know, is already contemplating suspending the whole foreign aid to the PA, part of the foreign aid to the PA. That's certainly a very significant club. And by the way, the same thing could apply, maybe should apply to the UN, which receives 22% of its budget from the U.S. at a time when 95% of UN country members which receive foreign aid from the U.S. vote systematically against the U.S. in UN deliberations. This is something which obviously contradicts America's best interests. So the tools are there. The major question is for both Israel and the U.S., do we or don't we want to learn from the past by repeating or by avoiding past mistakes? It seems to me that the president-elect will be a role model of political incorrectness, and hopefully the Israeli government will follow suit. And when it comes to political incorrectness, one arena should be the UN, another arena should be the policy towards the terroristic hate education Palestinian Authority, and I would say domestically in the U.S., part of the anti-establishment and politically incorrect nature of the incoming administration should also consider the attitude towards the Department of State. Should the new administration follow the top bureaucrats of the Department of State, or should the administration instruct the Department of State to follow the new policy shaped by the administration? My assumption is that as long as we do not read in the New York Times and Washington Post some leaks from top bureaucrats at Foggy Bottom criticizing the new Secretary of State and whoever will be the new Deputy Secretary of State, if there is no such criticism, then I think it would be a cause for concern. If there will be leaks about such criticism, then we would know that the appointments are solid appointments serving the best of America's interest. Well, I think it's a huge gap of world views. People are talking about the lack of chemistry between President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu. Personal chemistry is not a prime issue when it comes to leaders of different states. But it doesn't matter how positive the chemistry could have been between the two leaders. There's absolutely no way that one could have bridged the unbridgeable gaps or gap between the worldviews of Obama and Netanyahu. President Obama certainly has given up on unilateral U.S. National security or military action, and therefore submitting the U.S. to multilateralism. That's part of the reason for the dramatic erosion of U.S. posture of deterrence, and that's a major cause of concern for every single ally of the U.S., and by the way, not only Israel, but look at Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Bahrain, Oman. Those countries do not rely today on the U.S. as much as they used to prior to the Obama presidency. And in fact, in a concerning manner. The Gulf states, the pro-America Gulf states, as well as Jordan and especially Egypt, are closer to Russia today than they were 8 and 9 years ago. That's one of those gaps. Another one is the refusal of Obama to recognize Islamic terrorism for being Islamic. The refusal, in fact, by John Kerry yesterday to refer to Palestinian terrorism. He spoke about terrorism in general. He spoke about hate, education, and incitement in general. And there was no specific accusation and reference, let alone deep reference to Palestinian terrorism and Palestinian hate education. Obama has done the same thing when it comes to Islamic terrorism, and certainly Israel understands that unless you define clearly the threat, you cannot fight lucidly that threat. When it comes to Iran, obviously there is a huge gap which concerns not only Israel but primarily, again, Saudi Arabia and other pro-American Arab states in the Gulf. And the July 2015 agreement with Iran has marked a dramatic shift of ties between the Arab Gulf states and Russia, but also even more dramatic shift, and in this case positive shift, of their ties with Israel. And in a way, Israel should send a thank you note to the White House for the substantial cooperation between Israel and Gulf and Arab Gulf states, as well as Egypt and Jordan, when it comes to counter terrorism. But again, that improvement is a result of the dramatic erosion of the U.S. posture of deterrence. That erosion undermines U.S. national security, but more so it undermines national security of every single ally of the United States. And last and not least, it's the attitude towards the United Nations. President Obama considers the UN to be a major playmaker on the international court. Israel recognizes the UN for what it is. Basically a platform for anti-American, anti-Israel sentiments, and therefore any step, just like the recent UN decision and yesterday's speech by Secretary Kerry, any step which enhances the role of the UN in setting the international state of affairs undermines global stability, provides tailwind to rogue regimes, and provides headwind to the U.S. and Israel. Well, the point I've tried to make in a number of interviews here in Israel, that one should not assume that tension between Obama and Kerry on the one hand and Netanyahu on the other hand mean deterioration of U.S.-Israel relations, because as we know, every single American president from Truman until Obama pressured Israel. As we also know, while the tension has intensified unprecedentedly between the current administration and the Israeli government, the strategic cooperation militarily, commercially, has reached all-time high. U.S.-Israel relations constitute a very unique phenomena on the global scene. Because U.S. attitude towards Israel is not determined from top down, but in fact the opposite. U.S. attitude towards Israel has been determined from day one from the base of the American constituents, American population, all the way up through the representatives of the people in both chambers of Congress and impacting the executive branch. And many times, setting the course of U.S.-Israel relations in defiance of the American president. It happened during the current administration. It happened during the Bush Sr. and administration. And that has been the secret of U.S.-Israel relations, which have withstood presidents who were not enamored with enhanced U.S.-Israel relations, but in spite of their own position, the relations have systematically improved the scientific and commercial, but especially the industrial defense establishments have recognized the importance of Israel to the American well-being. And that plus the 400-year-old foundation of Judeo-Christian values in the U.S. have set the tone of relations. And certainly, it will be very, very apparent comes January 21st, because in the Trump-Pence administration, we have a combination of both the Judeo-Christian foundations, especially when it comes to Vice President Mike Pence, and then the geostrategic elements, again, when it comes to both Vice President Mike Pence and certainly President Trump. So as far as I'm concerned, and again, I'm aware that it will have to withstand the test of the coming months and years, I expect an expanded potential of relations for the mutual interest of both countries, provided that the Israeli government realizes the scope of that potential and not acting timidly when it comes to Israel's national security and Israel's assertiveness. My last sentence will be that when it comes to Israel's assertiveness, we should go back to the foundation of the Hanukkah holiday and refer to the statement made by Simon the Maccabee, who responded to a claim that the Maccabees were occupying territory, and Shimon's response was that this is not an occupied territory, this is the territory of our forefathers. I have no doubt that such a position is going to endear us to the coming administration, maybe not all of them, but it will endear us to the president and the vice president, and certainly it will be in line with the majority of the American people and American legislators who do not wish to see a feeble ally in the eastern flank of the Mediterranean. They would like to see an ally which is very assertive and very defiant, because on a rainy day you do need an ally which is willing to flex a muscle, even if somebody in Washington is not happy with that muscle.
Yoram, thank you very, very much. We can't thank you enough for your years and years of hard-earned wisdom, your knowledge, your resoluteness, and your very realistic yet positive perspective when it comes to all of these issues. I just want to say that for all of my years and Amet's years of activism, the greatest reward we have is the friendship of wonderful scholars, intellects, and diplomats such as Yoram Ettinger, who's part of our advisory board and our brain trust. Again, thank you so much for your continued...
And if I may say a word, not only to reciprocate, but I'm honored to participate in Amet's activities, and the way you, Sarah, have conducted Amet is consistent with the Hebrew spelling of Emet, because when you spell Emet in Hebrew, the Aleph and the Mem and the Taf, each such letter has a very, very stable foundation. And you certainly have established a very, very stable operation, which is based on emet, based on truth. And again, the Hebrew spelling, the Aleph is the first letter, the Mem is the middle letter, and Taf is the last letter. And this has been the operation of emet under your guidance and creativity, namely encompassing the beginning, the middle, and the end. You have always taken a strategic view, not a limited surgical view of matters. So thank you very much, and Shabbat Shalom, and happy Hanukkah to you and your team and all the participants in this call.